Happy Thursday afternoon. Believe it or not, this is CAUTAC meeting number 20. So thanks again. I can't say enough about your continued participation and guidance and just all the assistance that you are providing the DLCD team as we go through this rulemaking process. You'll recall last meeting we talked about proposed rules and guidance for partially vacant and redevelopment land for buildable land inventories. Today we have a pretty packed agenda. Jenna is going to take us through that first agenda item to revisit constraints, buildable land inventory constraints inside the urban growth boundary, and looking at those unsuitable lands outside of or in UGB study areas. It shows up on our agenda as one item, but we're going to kind of have consecutive discussions there and hopefully move through that agenda item pretty quickly, focusing on what is proposed for rules versus guidance. And then Karen is going to introduce our second topic, land use efficiency measures. That discussion is going to follow our more familiar rhythm that we're starting to get into, where Karen will introduce the topic, we'll ask for clarifying questions, then we'll do a poll, and then we'll get into our discussion. So a lot to get to today. Thanks in advance for keeping your comments concise. And if you hear something that others have said that resonates with you, feel free to give us a thumbs up if that will suffice for your comments. And with that, I will hand it over to Madeline, who's going to introduce our focus area and questions from the racial equity framework for today.
Thanks, Steve. Madeline Phillips, Public Facilities Planner with the Housing Division at DLCD. Today we're going to have a few different conversations that each lend themselves to an area of the racial equity framework that we have not yet focused on in some of our previous conversations related to measuring and evaluating outcomes and continuous improvement. Some of the questions that our team had as we were in the process of developing our thoughts on this topic had to do with estimating constraints and unsuitable land and the impact that has on how cities track, measure, and report outcomes, particularly in the context of, say, land use efficiency measures, where cities are able to, or jurisdictions rather, are able to identify places within their community that perhaps are rich with amenities that they're able to enhance or zone appropriate to allow for additional housing opportunities, potentially affordable housing opportunities in some cases, and evaluating how and in what ways racial equity is either manifested in ways that create more housing choice and opportunity for folks, but potentially how some of those choices could have undue burden on certain populations or could prevent some communities from having access to housing in particular places. I think what we want to focus on is how a city quantifies some of that work, how they track that work, and potentially how our rules can support jurisdictions moving in a positive direction for continuous improvement. So just a few thoughts to start off our conversation today before we get into the main topics. Steve, I'll hand it back over to you.
Thank you so much, Madeline. We will keep those in mind as we begin our discussions. And with that, I think Jenna is going to start us off talking about BLI constraints. So Jenna, take it away.
Yeah, thanks, Steve. As Steve mentioned at the top, we're revisiting this topic from last month, this time with some revised language to get some additional feedback from you all. So similar to last time, I'll go through the revised approach for BLI constraints, and we'll pause for questions and discussion, and then the same for unsuitable land. And I'll try to move swiftly through these slides because I know we have a lot on our agenda, but we can go back as needed. Next slide, please. So For accounting for constraints in the BLI or the buildable lands inventory, the revised approach, which is outlined in the discussion memo, has not changed drastically from version 1 and continues to prioritize flexibility as well as providing clarity and support to local governments through guidance. Next slide. This is the language that was included in the memo. And based on our last conversation where we talked about this topic, I didn't hear a lot of desire to make major modifications. A lot of you said support as is or support with minor modifications. So the biggest change here is based on the request to modify the rule language related to publicly owned land to ensure that local governments are doing their due diligence in coordinating with public entities, since sometimes publicly owned land is used for housing. So you'll see that change reflected here in the language. Next slide. Proposed guidance, which will be developed more next year, is intended to guide cities on more of the how for completing a BLI, which includes which public entities to reach out to, what data to use, and what assumptions can reasonably be made regarding partially constrained land. So we talked last time about mapping wildfire hazard areas and capacity assumptions. So guidance on how to evaluate those scenarios will be included here. Severely constrained in regard to hazard areas is also a term that appears in rule, but is not defined anywhere. So we are proposing to clarify what that means in guidance. And the next iteration of these rules will be combined with other sections of rule. So at that point, we'll be looking at the rules on a more holistic level, including how it connects to public facilities and development readiness. Next slide. All right, and I will just say we are not doing a straw poll this time. So instead, we're just going to have these two questions for the BLI constraints and unsuitable land. But I'm happy to answer any questions before we get to the second question.
Looks like Al's got a clarifying question.
Yeah, my question really has to do with what is a wildfire hazard, or what is a natural hazard, and whether the fact that we're now going into areas which have additional hazards, such as industrial areas and that kind of thing, does that affect how we look at hazards? Because there are obviously major hazards around areas like the railroad yards in Eugene, where we have the whole train song problem. We have railroad blast zones. We have all kinds of hazards that come out of human construction, but I'm not sure what to do with the word natural anymore, because we've decided that fire is really not a natural. It's usually a human hazard, and so are most of the other things we do. And how do we account for other kinds of hazards that would affect people living in housing? Do we find another way to do that as a constraint?
Yeah, that's a good question, Al. Goal 7 lists specific natural hazards that would be covered under this rule. So I'll just name them: floods, coastal and riverine, landslides, earthquakes and related hazards, tsunamis, coastal erosion, and wildfires. The goal language is a little bit flexible, though, and it does say local governments may identify and plan for other natural hazards.
So a quick follow-up question is, are we constrained in some way by that language in the goal, because what we're thinking about is whether land is constrained in terms of whether or not it meets housing needs. And does it meet housing needs if it puts people in the way of danger?
I think this is the first time this question's come up, Al, so we might need to kind of put a pin in that and think about that a little bit. I certainly welcome DLCD staff to chime in, but kind of the I think what you're asking is what about hazards that are not necessarily quote unquote natural hazards? And I don't know that we've discussed that before.
That's
Beth,
right. I'm fine with that.
okay. Beth, did you want to comment on that?
I just wanted to ask a follow-up question. I think what I heard in what you said, Al, was that when you're looking at buildable land, if you're looking at industrial buildable land, which is what you're describing for in the instance of Eugene. So, and I'm not sure that that's been contemplated as much in the discussions at this point, but I just want to make sure that you're asking a question that's much more specific to industrial land.
It is, I don't know if you can still hear me. Something just happened. Can you still hear me?
We can hear you, yes.
Okay. Yeah, that was a specific example. I can imagine it coming up possibly in other situations involving, like Mosier or, areas that are along railroad tracks that, may actually be in commercial or other kind of areas. And there are hazards that come out of public lands and other things as well, but it's most likely to happen in areas of heavy industrial. So I would say that's a prime example, but I'm not sure I would cabinet quite that narrowly.
Okay. Thanks. Jenna, did you want to follow up on this topic?
Yeah, I just wanted to say that I think you've highlighted something, Al, that is not clear in rule. And so it's sort of a question back to you all on what do you want clarified in rule? And is this something that would be helpful to have clarified in guidance?
Okay.
All right. Mary Kyle has clarifying question.
Right. It sort of relates to Al's, and just one thing on Al's thing. There's a major railroad line that runs through most cities like Portland. I'm a couple blocks away from it. So is a whole bunch of really urbanized Portland. So anyway, that's kind of because that's how our cities were built, right? Around railroads. But my question was related to what is meant by in the definitions. And I'm sorry if I've asked this before. I know I've asked it inside my brain, but I don't know if I've said it outside. And if I have, I don't remember the answer. So, but it says buildable land includes these various things unless it is subject to natural resources protection measures under statewide planning goals 5, blah, blah, blah. And it's really 5. And I think this kind of gets to some of what Al was saying. Under goal 5, you can designate natural resources, but then allow them to be, allow that area to be developed subject to certain conditions. And I think that's actually also an answer to at least some of the natural hazards, the ability to develop in those areas or around natural hazards can be, there's remedial measures that can be taken, like clustered away or clustered development on a property, certain number of feet away from a stream, certain building materials and other things like defensible space, wildfire resilient building materials. There's other things like that that can be built in, whether it's flooding or wildfire or things like that, that still leave at least some of the land buildable. So, so my question was really in that, what do we mean? Are we taking out all land that has some kind of a goal 5 designation on it, or just the completely protect designation from goal 5? Because, yeah.
Sorry, I thought someone else was going to jump in. Yeah, I mean, it's areas that are designated in a goal 5 inventory as you cannot develop in those areas, the most protected
all.
areas. And in
Okay.
some cases, some cities may have certain like overlay zones where they have
Right.
additional protections that maybe allow some limited development,
Mhm.
or something like that. Kevin?
I just wanted to, I mean, one example that the department, we've been talking to local governments about to some degree is wetland protections. So under Goal
Mhm.
5, cities can choose to, they go through a Goal 5 program for wetlands and they determine what are significant wetlands and non-locally significant wetlands, right? And so the significant ones, the cities would apply some level of protection to it, can go anywhere from like nothing can happen here, or maybe it's only within this distance, or maybe it's a small portion or what have you, and in other instances, there are non-locally protected wetlands where we know the reality has been over time that it is more and more difficult to mitigate for wetlands. There are fewer wetland banks. It's more and more expensive. And so one of the things we've talked about is that practically speaking, and I think we're accepting of the idea, and you may see this in guidance. I don't think it's something that we would ever want to put in rule, but something where if there's a documented pattern of, hey, even non-locally protected wetlands, are not getting built on to this extent just because of the cost and challenge of that. We might say, hey, local governments might use that information in their BLI to discount, if you will.
Okay.
So there's some level of protection, but it's not the full protection that would be applied under Goal 5.
Right. I just wanted to make sure it didn't prohibit including at all anything with sort of a Goal 5 overlay, because there's lots of cities that have protective. So that's great. Thanks. That answers my question.
All right. Oh, Beth, go ahead.
I think I want to just follow up on one thing Kevin said, which is that I think a lot of these unclear points, part of the idea with the guidance document will be bringing clarity to these topics as much as possible. And the nice thing with the guidance document is that it can be revised fairly easily later in time when we find the instances that we just haven't covered.
Thanks, Beth. Corey, go ahead.
Yeah, I just had a clarifying question around the guidance piece of this, because I noted in the memos that that's not going to be ready until 2026. And so I just wanted to hear from the team about how they're thinking about handling that process and timing. Are those documents things that this group is going to be weighing on and providing comments on, or is that happening kind of, parallel and aside from what we're up to here?
I think when it comes to topics on what specifically goes in guidance, we're happy to take those comments now. Just know that we will not be, substantially developing those until 2026. But comments on those on what goes in guidance is always welcome.
Mary Kyle.
Sorry, it just in the guidance, which is going to provide guidance on how to account for publicly owned land, including colleges and universities. I think you might want to include private colleges and universities in that too, not just, and maybe golf courses, which are public and privately owned also.
Okay. Sounds like we're transitioning from clarifying questions into our comments and discussion. And I know we want, this is perfect. We want to focus on what's in rule versus what's in guidance, and looking for your thoughts on that, particularly from any local government practitioners. Obviously, we want to hear from everyone, but any thoughts from our local government folks are particularly welcome. Al.
Yeah, just a thought from a legal guy, and that is that we need to keep in mind that guidance is just that. It's not something that local governments will ever be able to legally rely on, because nobody owes them any deference on that. DLCD doesn't have to follow it, and it can't enforce it if a city doesn't follow it. Guidance is simply some indication of what staff thinks. And that's all it is. Otherwise, it has to be in the form of a rule or a goal amendment. So it's really kind of important to think about, it's almost as if there ought to be some kind of a disclaimer, like, cigarettes can be harmful to your health at the beginning of a guidance, so that nobody thinks they are more than they are.
Are you saying guidance can cause damage to our health, Al?
Absolutely. It has in the past. Okay.
Thank you for that clarification, Damien.
Thanks, Steve. I'll be brief. I think I appreciated the discussion around the proposed changes to 00056 regarding coordination with public entities on how to inventory their land. And I think that would be a good topic to expand on in guidance in terms of not just who's included, but the how, in terms of, recommending some best practices, like, do you write a letter to them? Do you call them up? Do you ask them about their, immediate plans in the next 10 years or 20 years? Because we've seen, I think, plenty of examples of those where, for example, some churches have developed their property with housing. We've had one golf course that sold and has been developed with some housing. Some golf courses are still going strong. So happy to provide some examples if that helps to clarify or flesh that out better.
Certainly, Damien. Thanks. I'm sure any follow-up email from you or the mural board or what have you would be more than welcome. Beth.
I'll mention that I don't think that churches or golf courses are considered public. It's publicly owned, and as Mary Kyle mentioned, including privately owned universities, colleges there. So I think churches and golf courses might well be handled differently than what you're thinking about, Damien.
Okay. Other thoughts on rules versus guidance in terms of these revised approaches that Jenna presented? And if not, we can move on to the UGB study areas, unsuitable lands. Looks like we're ready to move on to that. Great. Thanks, everyone. Oh, Mary Kyle.
Sorry.
Last second.
Sorry, I was trying to, anyway, there's been a reference in this memo and last time to this land supply market factor discount thing that I think some other state is using. And if at some point when we can get more information about that, that would be great.
Okay, I think we covered that at one of our previous meetings, but we can certainly bring that back at some point. Yeah.
I don't remember being told how it's working, wherever it's being worked, or what the discount, like the formula or something. Maybe I missed a meeting.
Okay.
Anyway,
well,
don't need to do it yet now.
Noted. Thank you.
If it's in a memo, just sorry, so that I don't.
Yeah, I'm sure someone will loop back with you on that. Thanks. You, Mary Kyle. All right, Jenna.
Okay. Thank you. So pivoting now to unsuitable land in UGB study areas, the revised approach for this rule section has changed a little bit since version 1, with the same goal of maintaining current flexibility while also providing clarity by adding to the list of hazards and natural resources that are allowed to be removed from the study area, and also supporting local governments through developing guidance. Next slide. So based on the feedback from last time in conversations with our natural hazard specialists, we did add back in the requirement for cities to rely solely on the flood insurance rate map to estimate flood areas. So you'll see that language not crossed out anymore. And we're also adding wildfire to the list of hazards along with others covered by Goal 7 to better align with the BLI rules. So that it's just a little bit more clear to local governments that the same areas could be removed in both sets of analyses. Next slide. And then based on discussions with agency partners and the feedback to consider habitat not already stated in rule, changes were also proposed for this section to more clearly allow for the removal of other habitat areas from the study area. So you'll see that language added here. Next slide. And then similar to the guidance for buildable land inventories, guidance for unsuitable land will include recommended data sources and considerations for discounting capacity in some cases. Future iterations will also focus on defining liquefaction and other language proposed to be added to the rules, as well as better connecting this set of rules to the other rule sections. So making sure we are cross-referencing. Next slide. That was a really brief overview. I'm happy to go back if needed. But again, we're not doing a straw poll, but I'm happy to take clarifying questions. Otherwise, we can dive into the conversation on what should be in rule versus guidance.
Brock, your hand's been up and down a little bit. Hopefully your previous questions were answered, but go ahead.
Yeah, my previous was forgetting that we weren't talking about this portion yet. So one clarifying question. Which part of House Bill 2001 directed the inclusion of this piece? And then I do have a follow-up as well.
I think our rulemaking charge, our Caltech charge has been to increase certainty, clarity, and reduce analytical burden for local government. So I think the goal here was to make sure we are maintaining flexibility in rule by not forcing local governments to remove or include certain areas in their preliminary study area, but also making sure we are being clear on what is allowed to be removed, and putting that in rule gives a little bit more certainty than guidance. So that was the intent there with this approach.
And so my follow-up there, because that's kind of the direction that I thought this was coming from, I think this actually does the exact opposite, because I went through, and after Jenna and I had a conversation on the phone to go over some clarifying questions, I went through and I used the ODFW compass tool to map the sensitive species, core and low density greater sage grouse habitat, habitat for wildlife connectivity, which in the map is the priority wildlife connectivity corridors, all strategy habitats, which would include the key habitats in the State Wildlife Action Plan. The species of greatest conservation need is not in the ODFW compass mapping system. The sensitive species includes those 53, and that is in the map, but the currently almost 300 and proposed almost 330 species that are in that SGCN category are not included there. Statewide, and I printed this out because I know I wouldn't be able to share it directly with everybody at this time. This is what that map looks like. And what you'll see here, and my apologies if I missed this a little bit because I'm trying to do it while looking at my own screen. Right here in Portland, this is an area where there's a little bit of gap there. You'll also see it over here in the Bend area and up here along the Columbia River. And then if you zoom in to, let's say, the area around Bend and Redmond, right, you're seeing that you have wildlife constraints coming around the bottom. Is that upside down? Oh, no, it's right side up. Okay. Wildlife constraints coming around the bottom here and out to the west. So, and additionally out here, so you see that the only real areas that wouldn't be precluded from the study area if they chose to exclude habitat would be here, here, and there, where I made those little red hash marks. Looking at a statewide zoning map, every area that is not currently within a UGB or is not heavily encumbered by habitat is prime farmland and EFU zoning, or it's forest land. And so my concern, and the reason that I say that I think this does the opposite in terms of reducing risk of litigation, reducing uncertainty, repetitive unnecessary procedures, is that if a city goes through and they choose not to exclude habitat from their study area, when they have the ability to do so under rule, they're going to get sued by the Nature Conservancy, Sierra Club, Center for Biological Diversity. But if they don't exclude those areas, and then everywhere that they include in their study area for expansion is prime farmland or EFU land, they're going to get sued by a lot of other groups. So I understand the intent, and I really want to make clear that I am not saying that we should not care about habitat conservation. We absolutely should. But this needs to be something that's in guidance. Otherwise, we are creating a litigatory gridlock for our cities in perpetuity, in my opinion.
Thanks for that comment. Madeline, did I see that you had something? No, you're good. Okay. Of our three people with their hand raised, is anyone following up on the specific issue that?
Yes, I am.
Okay,
Is Al.
Al and then Alexandra, and thanks for your patience, Martha.
Okay, thank you. I hadn't really thought about what Rocky just talked about, but I would just recommend to the staff and everyone else that go back and take a really close look at the Court of Appeals decision in the McMinnville case, where it talks about the relationship between sort of statutory and statutory tiering requirements and the Goal 14 balancing requirements. Basically, what it's saying is that I think it's saying is that if you want to exclude things that need to be addressed and should be addressed under the balancing requirements of Goal 14, if you want to change those and exclude things that would otherwise be included as part of a balancing process, you either need to amend the goal or you need to amend the tiering statute. And so I think Brock's right. I think that probably excluding those in the study areas would be something I wouldn't want to see in a rule or guidance. If we're going to see that, that should be in a goal amendment or legislation. Thanks.
Thanks, Al. Alexandra?
Al's points are wonderful and not ones that I had thought of yet. So that's a great call out. Really appreciate Brock. He and I talked about the mapping beforehand, and I think especially for my members, it's really hard when you're looking at those maps and they are everything, all of the land, and it's not something that we don't want to take into consideration entirely, but it is something that we have to address very carefully because we are in a litigation prone system. And when you're talking about just that degree of overlapping maps and things like that, it just becomes increasingly complicated. It kind of creates that decision paralysis of what we're balancing. And when we're talking about this really supposed to be about smoothing the process, I don't think that quite meets that goal.
Thanks. Damien, are you on the same topic?
Well, I had more feedback just on the guidance part of it. If now's a good time, or I can wait.
Go ahead, and then we'll go to Martha.
Okay. Well, just on this topic of looking at wildlife habitat, I appreciate what the team's trying to do in terms of looking at these areas that are, I'm going to qualify to saying maybe more important from a Goal 5 perspective to, not include in UGB for urbanization. What I would ask the team to consider for guidance is when you look at the type of map Brock was showing a moment ago, providing some kind of guidance on how to maybe scale that appropriately so that cities can maybe turn on and turn off different layers in terms of wildlife habitat. And if they're in a situation where they're looking at all the habitat that leaves them with not much in the way of area for urbanization, having the ability to kind of then weigh and balance what's the most important habitat that should be maybe excluded, and then maybe looking at other habitat that could be included, but may then require the city to look at a Goal 5 EC to see, okay, if we allow these potentially conflicting uses, what might we need to do to mitigate the impacts of these conflicting uses?
Thank you, Damien. Thank you. Martha.
Thanks. As it turns out, it is kind of related to this whole conversation. I was going to ask, mostly because I don't work for a city, I work for a county, sort of in practice, because this may exclude land in your preliminary study area language is already in the rule, and this is just a revision and adding, it seems like, additional circumstances in which you can exclude land. And I guess I'm curious, it does tie into what everyone's been saying, like in practice, how this happens, because may exclude means you can exclude it. And so then a jurisdiction's getting into a situation of, well, I'm making a choice potentially to exclude landslide area, but not tsunami area. Like, I don't understand how that happens in practice. And it does seem kind of like ripe for litigation if you're making choices to somehow prioritizing some, hazard over another one. And I guess I don't really, it's more of a question of how this like works in practice, and is the issue that it's not working well and it's being litigated all the time? And if so, I would agree, it's nice to have some more specificity, but I don't think it actually solves that problem.
Go ahead, Kev.
I'll just try to, I think, try to respond to the question you're asking. So the current language does talk about cities may exclude. Al may know case law that I'm not familiar with, but generally I think this operates as sort of safe harbors that cities rely on. So may exclude means, hey, if you pick from the menu, you can exclude those areas categorically, and that comports with the rule. I'm not aware of a lot of litigation on that question at this time. Obviously broadening the list might, could change the landscape there. But and if there are other folks who are familiar with litigation on this point, please weigh in. But I'm not really aware of any.
Thanks, Kevin. Are any other practitioners that want to respond to Martha's question and how you've approached these different unsuitable lands? Heather.
Well, particularly on the landslide part, I know that there's different types of landslides and different landslide risks. So this just says landslides, but I could see a city looking at different types of landslides or landslide potential, I should say, and deciding to include or not include based on those different levels of risk. I think for me, the fact that it says may, I'm kind of thinking about that, and that seems that's not changing, that these areas could be excluded, and we're broadening it. I will say that in checking with our staff, we have the same concerns about the ODF and W mapping that's been expressed. So I just wanted to support that. But because it's a may, then it seems like that would be okay. But we would love it if DLCD and ODF and W could work together to get better data and better maps, which I think was brought up earlier. That would be super helpful.
Thank you, Heather. Damien?
Thanks, Steve. Just to be really brief, I don't think I can answer that question briefly in terms of how we've excluded land, but I could follow up with the Miro board once it's sent out and include some links to our most recent buildable land inventory.
That would be great. Thank you so much. Well, this is great food for thought. Jenna, did you get what you're looking for in terms of feedback from the group before we move on to our next topic?
Yes, I really appreciate the thoughts. And even if you don't like something, it's great to hear it because, we're only at version 2 and we will have a version 3. We'll probably have a version 4, probably have a version 5. So this is this is the window of opportunity to put it all out there. And we will have a Miro board. So if you have more thoughts after the meeting, please feel free to put it there, or you can send an email. But thanks.
Great. Heather.
Sorry, I just wanted to ask one question. So the revision to A3, big game mitigation corridors is struck out, and now it says habitat identified for wildlife connectivity, including big game. So that revision seems to be in the spirit of this of being much broader than what it was originally. And so I'm just curious if there's some additional information staff has about what you were thinking about other than big game for that area, because it does seem to be pretty broad, and I'd be curious like what you're thinking about the resource information that would be available for that.
This
Go
is
ahead,
on
Brock.
that same topic. Heather, on the compass mapping, there's a layer filter called priority wildlife connectivity areas, I think it's called. You can only
Oh
see
yeah, you said that.
3 words there.
Yeah.
That's the one that I've understood this to translate to.
Oh, this is directly to that map. Okay, got it. That's helpful. Great, thank you.
All right. Thanks, everyone. Well, let's move on then to our next topic, land use efficiency measures, and Cotton is going to walk us through it.
All right, you all. Jen is a lot more generous. You get 2 versions of not joking. I don't know if I'm gonna have the energy for version 4 or 5. We'll see. So I'll pause on this slide real quick, just for a little bit. So just to orient us where we're at, after a city has inventoried their land, and estimated capacity on that buildable land, they will then look at whether they have sufficient residential capacity on that buildable land to accommodate 20 years of growth for their allocated housing need. And so that's kind of what we're talking about now. Once it's been inventoried and the capacity has been estimated, what happens if a city has sufficient residential land? And what happens if there's a deficiency of residential capacity? Next slide, please. And I'll be really brief on my presentation today, similar to Jenna. I did have a couple typos in the memo, and I want to apologize for that if it caused any confusion. I will highlight those typos and the fixes to them, and you'll see that corrected online as well. But just to make a quick note that if sufficient capacity is determined by a city, their housing planning work isn't necessarily done. Their goal 14 and land need work might be complete, but a city will still need to select actions for their housing production strategy to increase both housing production and affordability, and then thirdly, housing choice. And I understand that, or we as staff, the department understand that cities under 10,000 will not be required to do that work. That's for cities that have that HPS requirement with population of 10,000 or more, or in Martha's case, there are some urban unincorporated communities. Did I say that right? I hope I got that right, Martha. The counties will be doing that as well in the metro region. All right, next slide. I might go really fast through this slide. You all have been participating in these conversations for a year. We highlighted our takeaways from our discussions last year in 2024 for this group to really want to understand efficiency measures in the context of OHNA, understanding efficiency measures in contrast to other production strategy actions, understanding some statutes around estimated increased capacity over achieved density, and then understanding efficiency measures in the context of CFEC, CFAs, et cetera, et cetera. But that is all in the memo, so I'll skip through this one and we'll go to the next slide. So let's see here. This is the first definition. So this is a typo on the memo if you all are following along. Let's see, that's page 3 of the memo. My apologies. There is an existing definition on page 3 of that memo for zone to allow. One of our internal staff notes, I accidentally left it in there, so my apologies that the second line in that definition should not have what's in parentheses, and you'll see that corrected in the memo. But those 2 definitions for density and for zone to allow are existing definitions in rule, and we're just moving them into the definition section. We're not proposing amending those. What we are proposing is a new definition. What is a land use efficiency measure? We've often colloquially heard of efficiency measures, but in the context of a production strategy and OHNA, do they differ from housing production actions? And so this is the definition we offer, and we'll have time to talk about that. I will say, if you read that first sentence in the definition, you'll notice that we intend the definition to be applicable to both buildable lands inventories and in the capacity, the housing capacity analysis, as well as the BLI in the economic opportunities analysis. So you'll note that. And then I'll just clarify for folks that right now, where staff have drawn the policy lines, or where we're distinguishing some policy choices here, is that all land use efficiency measures can and should be, will be viewed as action items for a housing production strategy for those cities that are required to do that, the larger cities, but not the inverse. So not all housing production actions are land use efficiency measures. And we can discuss that as well as a TAC. So that's the definition. And then next slide, folks had last year talked a lot about, well, how do you know if you've taken enough efficiency measures? How do you know that you've done enough to create additional capacity within the existing UGB? And so we're proposing a safe harbor. And I'm sure there will be questions and discussion. We're hoping to hear back your feedback on this, but we're trying to answer the questions around, you know, how do you demonstrably reduce a residential land need? How do you demonstrate that through an increase in residential capacity? There were some existing safe harbors in rule. You notice they're pretty lengthy. I think Kevin had shared cities had tried to use it. It was pretty complex. Last year, maybe Beth had shared that Madras might have attempted this in an HNA in the past. And it might have been the method that they had used as some of these tables and these safe harbors. But within those existing safe harbors was something called an incremental housing density safe harbor. And this more simplified safe harbor is modeled after that to some degree. I'm going to skip over this and we'll have plenty of time to discuss. Next slide. So these are some caveats to use of those existing safe harbors. And we looked to see if these requirements for cities existed anywhere else in statute. Some of them did, so we could eliminate them. Others were pretty well rounded only in rule to remind cities that they needed to have these policies in place in order to use the safe harbor. Again, my apologies that the grammar here, I could have tightened that up a little bit more, so my apologies. In a future version that if we come back with version 2, it'll probably read something like, when using this safe harbor, a local government may, a local government cannot. So there's some redundant language in there, but know that that'll get cleaned up. I think one of the interesting things is a credit to Brock gave me a call and said, well, it's interesting here that the existing caveats or the existing requirements for use of the safe harbor allow cities outside of metro to use a local housing vacancy rate. And how do you reconcile that with now the housing need allocation that's coming from DAS is using a uniform 5% vacancy rate for all cities across the state? And certainly that 5% vacancy rate is that healthy vacancy rate. You don't want it too low, you don't want it too high. So I'd be interested in discussing that with the TAC. So that's, I think that last bullet point here, D. Let's see, do I have another slide? Yeah, so I think one of the last topics we touched on last year was around, well, when do efficiency measures need to be adopted? So we do our housing capacity. Traditionally, when an HNA process was happening, if there was a land deficiency, you had to adopt those efficiency measures at the time of adopting the HNA so that a city could really look at what is my capacity based on the policies that are going to be locally adopted to create additional residential capacity. And then determine from there, well, do I need a UGB amendment or not? And so I think under the new paradigm where we have the ability to adopt a housing production strategy with action items, we have an ability to do a midpoint report around our production strategy. We will have a cyclical schedule that tells cities that they will do a housing capacity analysis every 8 years. There's just a new paradigm for when these efficiency measures could be adopted if a city wanted to lock in their HCA and those housing need allocation numbers that came in that year. So you could lock that in, and then you could have a few more months, or you could have a year, a couple years even, what time you needed to select efficiency measures and then adopt them locally. It would still stand that as it is today and as written in statute, that a UGB amendment could not occur prior to adoption of efficiency measures at the local level. Maybe we'll sail right on through and go to our last slide here. I know there's been a lot of talk about, well, what's going to be in guidance, what's going to be in rules, and you'll see we kept it pretty simple. You know, in rules, we need to define what is an efficiency measure versus a housing production action. There's a very complex safe harbor that went mostly unused, so we wanted to simplify that and provide an alternative. And then around the production strategy, those cities that are large enough and required to do housing production strategies, could we give them more options for when they could go through the policy discussions and the public involvement around efficiency measures at the local level and have some options for when to adopt those. That's really what we're trying to do in rule. It's a few things, they're significant things, but I think they're all simplification. And then there's a lot of questions around, you know, when we're estimating our capacity and understanding an efficiency measure and trying to understand validating, quantifiable validation for the density assumptions that we have. I think there's a lot that we can put into guidance around, well, here's my contextualized housing need, and I have a type mix from that, and now I need to do the land use planning for that to accommodate for that housing type mix. So you'll see on the right-hand side there what we have proposed for guidance. I will leave it at that.
All right. So following our familiar pattern here, we want clarifying questions before we move to our poll, and then we'll get into discussion. So clarifying questions. Brock, go ahead.
I'm so sorry. May I interrupt you, Brock? Apologies. One more. I think there's an area in the memo where we cited statutes where we probably should have cited rules. And that was, let's see. It's on page 6. So I think B and C on page 6. Sorry.
All right. Well, we have lots of clarifying questions here. So,
all right.
Brock, go ahead.
How did we land on a 20% increase in achieved density since the last cycle for the safe harbor? And the reason that I bring this up, I'm sure that there are cities in the metro area like Portland that would be able to achieve 20%. I mean, all of theirs comes from redevelopment, right? But particularly as we're comparing this to what the needs forecast is for the next 20 years based on the DAS methodology. The current underproduction is weighted about 85% towards housing that is between 0 and 80% AMI income. But when we look over the 20-year period, it's slightly more than 50% that's in the 80 to 120 and 120 plus categories. So just from a implementation concern, if we are prioritizing building what is currently undersupplied, which typically will be a higher density product, this safe harbor is not going to be usable once a city catches up there, because having an additional 20% above the already dense piece isn't going to allow you to use the safe harbor while meeting your higher income housing need necessarily. So I think that's a little bit tough. But because for example, if you start year one, the first cycle, and your last achieved density over the planning period was 10 units an acre. By your second cycle, it's 12, 14 and a half, 17.3, almost 21, 25, 30, 36, 43. And by the 10th cycle, you're up to 52 units an acre. If you start with an assumption of 7, by year 5, you get to 14 and a half. By year 7, you're up to 20. By year 10, you're up to 36. And that's with that 1.2 scale factor for each cycle being added in afterwards. So there is a law of diminishing returns here, where eventually, we can catch up on what's undersupplied, but if you're using the safe harbor going forward beyond that, you're probably not going to be able to rely on it.
So I think the question was, how did we arrive at the 20%? Karen, do you want to respond to that?
Yeah, I think, I mean, you nailed it on the head that it's a safe harbor. So a city can choose to use it. If at some point, 10 cycles later, that's 80 years from now, I don't think any of us are going to be around. The city's like, I don't want to use that safe harbor anymore. Like, we'll see what happens 8 decades from now. Totally get that. But it's actually less aggressive than the existing safe harbor. So in the existing rule, the safe harbor is called an increase in incremental housing density safe harbor, and it uses 25%. So that's 00408H. And so we modeled it loosely after that, and brought it down a bit. And it is, I'm open to hearing from governments. I think it was the city of Madras that may have used the safe harbor to some degree, and maybe not this specific one. What does that look like if you're doing your housing capacity analysis every 8 years? And remember that you are looking at, what can I accommodate within my existing urban growth boundary? Do I need to expand my urban growth boundary? Should I be looking at ways to use land more efficiently each time I go for an urban growth boundary expansion? How much so? And what does that look like exactly over 10 years? 80 years from now, should my density stay stagnant, or should my density be incrementally increasing over 8 decades? But anyway, Steve, back to you.
Great, thanks, Karen. I'm going to mix it up and go to Ted. We haven't heard from Ted today.
Took me by surprise there.
Yeah, I
Thank you,
gotcha.
Steve. I just have and I don't know if this is a clarifying question. I was puzzled by this part of the draft rules, because when I think of safe harbors, I think of, well, just that a jurisdiction can rely on an assumption without having to do additional work, but this still seems to require work on the part of a jurisdiction to demonstrate something. And it must be at least 20%. So I was just generally puzzled by the direction of this one.
Yeah, I don't know that I have a good response for you, Ted, except that I personally wasn't puzzled, because the safe harbor that exists requires some understanding of achieved density, right? And we're asking cities to know that. What is your achieved density? And then you're choosing measures that will demonstrate more efficient use of your land to increase that achieved density. So we didn't find it puzzling, but I'm curious what parts of that.
Just to add, I think what makes it a safe harbor is the idea that, hey, if you as a local government can demonstrate that, hey, we hit the 20%, here's the data. What that effectively means is, if somebody raises that issue in an appeal or anything like that, it's pretty easy to refute it. And that's how it's kind of intended to function. There is an onus, some level of analysis by the local government, but that's not completely unusual in the realm of safe harbors. Sometimes local governments do need to do some work to demonstrate, yes, we meet this or that safe harbor.
Thanks for that question, Ted, and the responses, though. It's helpful to go through that thought process of what the safe harbors are achieving and what they're requiring. Martha?
Thank you. I was also a little confused about that, and I think you cleared that up. I kind of have 2 questions. I'm not sure where to start. So in the memo on the bottom of page 5, under land inventory and response to a deficiency, there's a proposal to add the words partially vacant into a buildable land inventory must include vacant, partially vacant, and redevelopable land. And so we talked about that last meeting. And that's fine, except later in that same paragraph, it says for employment land, the inventory must include suitable vacant and developed land. Is that something different? Or should that language be the same, vacant, partially vacant, and redevelopable land? And this kind of gets to, I mean, it was in the previous section, the memo, buildable land was defined as vacant and developed land that could be redeveloped or something. And so it's like the use of these different terms says to me as a practitioner that it might mean something different. And I don't think it's supposed to. And so I guess maybe it does. That's
It
partially
does.
my
It does.
partially my question.
Yeah, and maybe I'll go to Beth and to Kevin. My understanding, and I realize counties haven't typically had to do HCA's, but cities that are doing their economic opportunity analysis, the EOA and the HCA, there is a differentiation. So there will be rules under this section that are for the EOA and rules that are, so that next paragraph you bump down to is for the EOA.
Right.
Paragraph is for the HCA.
So you don't have to inventory partially vacant land there, but you have to for residential? It doesn't seem logical to me.
Martha, there probably needs to be some change a little bit to goal 9 there to align this, and the definition of buildable land in goal 9 assumes that all developed land is redevelopable. It's
okay.
It's an issue. And partially vacant is really different in goal 9 than in goal 10.
Okay.
I have opinions about that, but I'll leave those aside.
Yeah, and I guess that's not really for this group, I guess. My point, I guess, why it flagged it in my brain is that if it was intended to mean the same thing, it should say the same thing. And so I guess I would say if we're adding partially vacant in here, just please make sure that you're looking and adding partially vacant anywhere else it needs to go, because it implies that it means something different if it doesn't say the same thing. So my second question is, I'm a little confused about number 9, about all the timing references in number 9. And you had it up on a slide earlier, and maybe maybe I'm the only one confused about this because we haven't had to do this work yet. But on the one hand, number 9 seems to say that you have to adopt your land use efficiency measures prior to or concurrent with the UGB expansion decision, unless of course you're not relying on the expansion, then you can adopt them anytime. But then it goes further to say for certain cities, for small cities, you have to adopt it concurrent with the housing capacity analysis. So then is that intended to take away all of that flexibility?
Yeah, there's some history there. That makes sense, Martha. Sorry about that. I could have been more clear. So what it says for cities has been the status quo in the practice for all cities. So that so all cities historically, due to case law, have had to adopt their efficiency measures concurrently with the adoption of their housing needs analysis. What we're proposing is to keep that status quo for small cities that are not required to do an HPS, but we're adding new options for those larger cities that they've never had before. And they are required to do an HPS, so there's a new framework that we can work under.
So what you're saying is a larger city can adopt it with their HCA or with their HPS, both of which are going to be before the UGB decision, or sometime in the first half of your housing production cycle, but wouldn't that potentially be after your UGB decision?
No, the UGB decision could be anytime after. I stand to be corrected, but no, it still would not be before the UGB decision.
But it has to be before the UGB decision, it says in the beginning. Anyway, the timing of it's confusing. It could just be me. Maybe take a critical look at sort of the language in there, I guess.
Beth, could you chime in? Sorry.
Yeah, and Kevin also probably has a piece of this. So basically what's happened in the past is this comes out of the McMinnville decision. I'm not an attorney, so the attorneys on here will correct me if I say stuff wrong. But in order to make sure that a city adopts it actually follows through on the unmet land need, they've been required to do their HCA, to figure out their land use efficiency measures, and then to do their UGB analysis. And then they can adopt all of those together. What we're talking about here now is breaking that relationship a little bit, saying you can adopt your HCA, go on and work on your land use efficiency measures, and you're probably at the same time working on your housing production strategy. And then you have to wait until your land use efficiency measures are done, and they could be adopted before you do your UGB expansion, but you can't do your UGB expansion without having adopted land use efficiency measures. The problem is that cities below 10,000, you don't have the HPS one requirements following really hard on the requirements of the HCA in terms of time, and you don't have the HPS as essentially another way to check in with cities, a requirement that allows, you know, DLCD to check in with cities is how I've been thinking about it. You could end up, you know, think about a place like Eugene or Bend, how long they spent after they did their HCA figuring out their land use efficiency measures, and doing their UGB expansion. Imagine trying to do that where you're trying to do a housing production strategy also. And you can't have adopted your HCA until you get all of that done. And that's a couple of years worth of work.
Kevin, did you have anything to add? I see you nodding.
Oh, I think Beth has explained it well. I will say, I think this language also accounts for the contingency where a local government may wish to adopt land use efficiency measures outside of a UGB expansion entirely. That's going to happen. That'll be housing production strategies. And we account for that. And the last sentence under sub 9 kind of, you know, says, hey, local governments can give themselves credit for efficiency measures adopted since the last, acknowledgement of the prior HCA. So we're trying to address that contingency as well, but thank you.
Well, and thank you. I understand all of that, and that all makes sense to me. I guess I would encourage you to take a critical look at the language and make sure that that's actually what it says. I found the way it's presented here to be a little bit confusing and may not actually say all of what you are wanting to say.
That's
Thanks,
super helpful, Martha. And I won't put it on you, but I'll put it on the rest of the team, the rest of the committee. The Miro board. Like if you have, you know, my team has been tremendous in helping me. So I didn't come up with all of this language on my own. But if you have any suggestions for clarifying language, some of you might be way more skilled at this than I am. Not to put anybody on the spot, but some lawyers here might have some good words. Let me know. Let me know on the Miro board. I'd appreciate that.
All right, we haven't got to our poll, so let's try to move through our final clarifying questions here quickly, get to the poll, and then have some discussion before we wrap up. Damien.
Thanks, Steve. I hope this is quick. So with the proposed definition of land use efficiency measure, is that intended to capture both housing measures, but also employment as well?
Yeah, I think you caught my explanation. So yes, a land use efficiency measure refers to those measures taken by a city to demonstrably reduce the land need. That is intended for both the EOA, employment, and housing. And then obviously the last sentence is for the housing production strategy, those measures that reduce residential land need or create greater residential capacity. So
Okay,
yes,
thank
that
you.
first sentence is for both, correct.
All right, thank you.
Thanks, Damien. Heather?
I had a question about 8. So I just wanted, and sorry if you addressed this, but the way I was reading the new language for 8 is that 8A, B, and C and D would only be able to be used as safe harbors if you are also meeting the 20% efficiency measure safe harbor.
No, that's my fault.
Okay,
That was
that
my
wasn't the
typo. That
intent.
I will clean that up. It's if you were
Sorry if
using
I missed that.
No. It's my fault for leaving that confusion out there. If you were using this land use or now I got myself confusing. Sorry. If you're using the safe harbor, then a city may choose to use those others, A, B, C, and D, or there's a couple a city must. So in other words, some of the manufactured home parks, allowing those parks, if you're going to use this safe harbor for a harbor on how many efficiency measures or enough efficiency measures, you also may need to make sure you allow for these manufactured home parks in these zones.
So, sorry. So, okay, I'll save it for the Mira board because maybe it's just me. So I'll make my comment there.
Yeah, let me clean up the language and I might email it out with version 2. And then happy to do, I'm thinking Heather and then Martha, if you guys need any one-on-ones, give me a call. We'll do a little one-on-ones as well in between version 1 and version 2, since I did leave some typos in there.
All right, Brock.
Yeah, and I guess two clarifying, maybe one of them's discussion, but so for the subsection 8 for Rule 40, I want to ask about the estimated to result in. And the reason I say that is that if you took all of your residential land and upzoned it by 20%, in theory, that would be estimated to result in a 20% increase. But we know that when you put an efficiency measure in place, it can sometimes take decades to reach full effect. So maybe you're only, you upzone it from 10 units an acre to 12 units an acre, but you only end up getting 10 and a half, right? You're expanding the upper limit, right? So that only gets you to 10 and a half. Well, now your estimated capacity change is actually only 5% instead of 20, even though you've upzoned everything by 20%. So would you have to upzone by like 80% and then hope that you still get the quarter of that upzone to be your 20? And is that what constitutes something being estimated to achieve 20% higher? Or is it saying, hey, we're upzoning by 20% and that's qualifying for the use of the safe harbor? And then the second clarifying question on 9, and just a flag that I do agree with Martha on this one a little bit about the first half of the housing production cycle piece. But in the base part of that subsection there, so local governments must adopt land use efficiencies prior to or concurrent with a UGB expansion decision. And then for that last part, in context of the UGB expansion, local governments may take note of and account for land use efficiency measures adopted after the acknowledgement of the prior housing capacity analysis. So if we're talking about, I realize that we want this to apply to both, as that was stated, but does it matter whether your UGB expansion is just residential or just employment, or if it's both? And shouldn't there be different thresholds for that, right? If you're doing an employment UGB expansion, if you've done residential land use efficiency measures, does that count? Just kind of looking for a little bit of.
I'm going to answer the latter question first. And Kevin, let me know if you hear anything wrong, but the safe harbor is specific to the HCA. The definition, that first line in that definition is for both the EOA and the HCA. So the definition can be used for the entire division. That division has very specific safe harbors for EOAs. So the existing division has a mix of safe harbors. Some of them are for an HCA, some of them are for an EOA. So when you look at a safe harbor we're proposing, is we're replacing an existing safe harbor for the HCA. We're not giving a safe harbor where this group today or ever has or will talk about employment opportunity analysis. So the safe harbor is for the HCA.
Okay, so it's just
residential. Distinguish those two things. And then your first question, oh shoot, I had it, I lost it. All right.
Estimated.
Yes, the estimated capacity. So your housing need allocation is by income bracket, and then you will look at your housing type mix. Once that housing type mix is established, you then will look at your zones and say, you know, which zones can allow for which housing types. And you may need to upzone, you may need to rezone. So you might be doing efficiency measures in a low density residential zone and a high density residential zone. And you may or may not be doing efficiency measures in your mid density residential zones. But you'll be looking across the city, once we do those efficiency measures in these different zoned districts, how much did the average achieved residential density increase? So every cycle you'll be looking at what is our average residential achieved density, and that's your base that you're safe harboring off of, that you're estimating a 20% increase.
Right, but is the estimate based on the fact that you increased on average your zoned residential capacity by 20%, or is so I guess what I'm trying to say is, does there need to be some kind of quantifiable validation here? Because without a quantifiable validation, you could say, okay, on average, we've increased our residential zone capacity by 20%. But if you require a kind of demonstration of that, right, you would probably need to upzone by like 80% in order to hopefully get 20.
I think you're taking it a little bit further than I would, but I think what might be helpful, Beth, unless you have a quick response, I can think we could run through an example, maybe next time we bring version 2 with you all. But I think cities are already estimating their achieved density. This is not new for cities. They can report their residential overall density. Then they're choosing measures. And they're saying from that achieved density, we think and estimate these measures will get us 20% more. Next cycle, they'll look at their achieved density. Off of that achieved density, they're choosing measures. We think these measures will get us 20% increase in capacity. But I see Kevin and Beth, if you have a quick response.
That helps. Thank you.
I think an example is or two will be helpful. This is really complicated.
Kevin, I think we will forego our poll because at this point I don't think it'll be too useful. I want to invite either Al or Heather if you wanted to revisit your question from earlier and go down that path a little bit more in the next 5 minutes. Al, I saw you had your hand up and put it down. Any other comments at this point? Heather,
This is Al. I'm sorry.
I'm gonna go to Heather first, and then Al, we can get to.
I'll just real quick. I noticed that on the memo, so this is a dish kind of following on the train of what is an efficiency measure. I noticed on the memo that there wasn't anything about financial tools being considered an efficiency measure. And I was thinking about redevelopment and how, for us anyway, that is a key efficiency measure action that would allow us to count that as redevelopable. And we would in theory have some math behind that, whether it's a redevelopment study, market study, or whatever that would demonstrate that. So I'm just hoping that that is clear in the guidance that you can count financial incentives or financial tools as an efficiency measure. Thanks.
Helen and Beth.
I'll do a quick response because I'll give full credit to Beth. She brought this up and she was like, your TAC members are probably going to ask you about this. Let us work on that, Heather, and we can bring, because I think Beth was saying, you know, the memo she put together from Echo Northwest around what are examples of efficiency measures. I think the department was trying to make every attempt to say there are ways you can demonstrate greater capacity and greater efficiency on your land within an existing UGB, and not all financial actions or incentives will do that. Redevelopment is a way to create more residential capacity, and it may be a more efficient use of the land. So that's something that Beth and I were talking about and did not prepare for you all in this version. So that's, let us sit on that. And Beth, did you have any additional thoughts before kind of what we might think about for version 2?
One, not all land use efficiency measures. It's not the universe of all possible measures. It's supposed to be some of the typical ones. And two, there's been a lot of discussion about financial measures and are they land use efficiency measures? Are they HPS actions only? And so I think that that's just been something that's been swirling around.
Thanks, Beth. Let's go to Al and then Ted, and then we'll wrap up for today.
Thanks, Steve. Following up on Ted's question, I think it would be helpful if we'd see an example of what it would take to establish that you're going to get a 15% increase. And then another example of how that would be different if you were estimating a 20% or 25% increase. So you can kind of tell the difference if you're a city or a participant in what the record would have to show when you're using the safe harbor and when you're not. And I think that kind of example would be extremely helpful because I simply can't picture it myself. The second thing that had to do, and it's somewhat related to it, had to do with the language in demonstrating the 20%. And I think that the words demonstrate and estimated get kind of turned around backwards and needs a little bit of wordsmithing. You can't demonstrate something by estimating it. You can estimate something if you can demonstrate that that estimate is valid. That seems to be what the rules require. And my third comment is that maybe I'm hearing it wrong, but it seems to me that what I'm hearing is that although the needed housing statute says that periodically jurisdictions need to prove two things. They need to prove that they do have adequate capacity, whether or not they're going to expand. And they need to prove that they don't have adequate capacity if they are going to expand. And we seem to be setting two different standards of proof for each of those things, which the statute doesn't do. We're basically saying if you want to prove up that you do need to expand, you got to go ahead and do those things concurrently, which is what I think the McMinnville case said, and also the statute. But if you really are a jurisdiction which would just as soon not have to get into the political and legal tangle of expanding UGBs, or you don't want to grow, you'd rather see your neighboring cities carry the load, then you can just make promises, and which is kind of what's been happening for the last 40 years. So I think there are some practical problems with that. That it incentivizes some behavior that I don't think we want to see. And then there are possibly some legal issues with that. So I think we need to go back and take a very close look at making a distinction. And if there is something in the housing production process, this new strategy thing, that waters down the statutory requirement of concurrency on proving up on your 20-year housing need, I'd like to see it. Thanks.
Thanks, Al. I'll just say on your number 2, I heard a clear invitation from Karan to help with language clarity as we move forward. So encourage your help there. Ted?
Thanks. I suspect we don't have time to get into it. So a comment about determination of land need. So section 4, right before efficiency measures. And this is specific to Metro. We don't get an allocation of housing need. So I think some of the proposed language unplugs some connections that we need to maintain about how Metro does its own forecasting. We don't get an allocation of housing need. So some potential issues there.
Thanks, Ted. All right, go ahead, Karen.
Yeah, real quick follow-up on Ted's. So you're talking about section 0040 under division 24?
Yes, section 4 there, that's the determination of 20-year residential land needs.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, and I gotta go back and look at your 350, I think it is, the statute. Okay, yep. I'm following you.
All right. Well, thanks, everyone. We knew it was going to be a packed agenda, but we got here. A few things I heard today, certainly not comprehensive, but regarding the constraints conversation that Jenna led us through, looking at that, not wanting to pit habitat areas against farmland and trying to figure that out, a more nuanced approach to that. In terms of the efficiency measures, sounds like we need to do some more work on the safe harbor. I didn't hear many comments on the definition, Cotton, but I heard comments on safe harbor and then maybe some clarity on the concurrency piece is what I heard today. Cotton mentioned there's going to be a Miro board and maybe another version of some of this that we'll be sending out. And some of you have already volunteered to provide additional comments, so thank you for that. Our next meeting as a group is on June 5th. I believe our topic is urban reserves. So looking forward to that. And for those who are tracking the RAC, the next RAC meeting is on June 11th, and they will be discussing the topics we've covered, partially vacant and redevelopable land and land use efficiency measures. So we'll be introducing some of that work to them. Cotton, Jenna, Madeline, anything to add before we adjourn for today?
No, thank you all for your time with the materials and everything you brought forward today. Really appreciate it.
All right. Thanks, everyone. We'll see you in a few weeks.
Thanks all.
Thank you.
Thank you.